My family called my son a failure and made him eat outside, alone, in the cold, while 40 people celebrated Christmas Eve without him. And I let them do it. I sat at that table and I watched my own boy shiver behind a pane of glass, and I told myself that if I just stayed quiet a little longer, everything would be fine. Then, at exactly 8:14 that night, the front gate buzzer rang, headlights swept across the frozen lawn, and 40 police officers in full dress uniform marched up my father's driveway in 2 straight lines, and every single one of them raised a hand to their brow in salute, aimed at the man eating alone on the porch steps. If you have ever sat at a table full of people who share your blood and felt like a stranger in your own family, tell me where you're watching this from tonight, because I think you'll understand every word of what I'm about to tell you. I need to take you back. Not to that porch, not yet. Back to a spring morning 36 years ago, when I was 22 years old and I did the one thing my father, Preston Whitfield, never forgave me for. I fell in love with a beat cop named Robert Hargrove. My father built his name on 3 generations of Whitfield money: real estate, a law firm downtown with his name carved into marble above the door, and a seat on more charity boards than I could count. In my father's world, there were people who mattered, and there was everyone else. Robert was, in my father's exact words, everyone else. I remember standing in my father's study the night I told him we were engaged. He didn't yell. Whitfields never yelled. He simply set down his glass of scotch, looked at me the way you'd look at a stain on a white tablecloth, and said, "You can marry the help if you want, Eleanor. Just don't expect the house to open its doors to him." I married Robert anyway, in a small church with 26 guests, none of them named Whitfield except me. And for 12 years, I did not need my father's doors. Robert and I had a walk-up apartment, a second-hand car, and a son named Daniel who used to fall asleep on his father's chest, listening to the police scanner crackle in the next room like a lullaby. I have never in my life been as rich as I was in that apartment. Then, on a Tuesday in October, 3 men robbed a pharmacy 4 blocks from our home. Robert was 2 minutes away when the call came in. He was the first officer on scene. He got the pharmacist's teenage daughter out through the back door before the 3rd shot was fired. The bullet that killed my husband entered through his left shoulder and never should have been fatal. It was fatal because the ambulance took 19 minutes to arrive in a neighborhood the city had stopped caring about years before. Daniel was 12 years old. He wore his father's badge on a string around his neck to the funeral, and he has never, not once in the 22 years since, taken it off for good. My father came to the funeral. He wore black, he shook hands, he said all the correct sympathetic things in that smooth attorney's voice of his. And 3 weeks later, when the life insurance ran short and the landlord raised the rent, he was the one who offered to bring Daniel and me back into the family fold, back into the Whitfield house, back under the Whitfield roof, and the Whitfield rules, and the Whitfield silence about the man I had loved and lost. I said yes. God forgive me, I said yes. Because I was 34 years old with a grieving son and $1,100 in a checking account, and pride does not keep a child fed. I moved back into my father's house. I let him pay for Daniel's school uniforms and summer camps, and eventually his college tuition. And in exchange, I watched my father slowly, patiently, methodically erase my husband from the family record, the way you sand a name off a headstone. He never said Robert's name again. Not once. Not at a single dinner. Not at a single holiday. In 22 years. Instead, he said things like, "Well, we all make our choices, don't we, Eleanor?" with a little smile that told the whole table exactly which choice he meant. Daniel grew up in that house on the hill, but he never once belonged to it. My father's other grandchildren, my sister Vivian's children, grew up groomed for the family businesses, sent to the right schools, coached in the right handshakes. Daniel grew up watching them from just outside the frame, the way you watch a party through a window you're not invited to walk through. He was smart, sharper than any of them if I'm honest. And I am trying very hard in this telling to be honest with you, even where it costs me. But intelligence was never the currency that mattered in that house. Bloodline mattered. Ambition mattered. The right kind of ambition. When Daniel turned 21, my father sat him down in that same study where he'd once told me I could marry the help, and offered him a position at Whitfield & Cole, on a fast track, groomed to make partner before 30. It was, in my father's mind, a magnanimous gesture, a correction of Daniel's unfortunate bloodline through the sheer force of Whitfield opportunity. Daniel turned him down. He told my father, calmly, the way his father used to talk, that he'd already applied to the police academy. I have never seen my father's face do what it did in that moment. It was like watching a crack spread silently across a pane of glass. No sound, just a slow, permanent fracture. "You want to be the help," my father said. Not a question, a verdict. "I want to be my father," Daniel answered. And from that day forward, in Preston Whitfield's house, my son ceased, in every meaningful way, to exist. He still came to holidays. I made sure of that much. I begged for that much, honestly, on the strength of nothing but a mother's guilt and a mother's stubbornness. But he came as a guest who had overstayed an invitation nobody had truly extended. He sat at the far end of the table. His accomplishments went unmentioned, while Vivian's son Chip's law school acceptance was toasted with champagne 3 separate years running. And whenever conversation turned uncomfortably close to what Daniel actually did for a living, my father had a phrase he liked to use, delivered with a smile so smooth it could cut glass. "Failures eat where they belong." He said it the first time when Daniel was 23, freshly graduated from the academy, and made the mistake of showing up to Thanksgiving still slightly out of uniform, badge glinting at his belt. My father took one look at him and said those 5 words to the whole table, and laughed like he'd made a joke about the weather. Nobody laughed with him. Everybody laughed at Daniel. I want you to remember that phrase. Failures eat where they belong. Hold on to it, the way you'd hold on to a key you don't yet know which door it opens, because I promise you, it is coming back. It always comes back. There was one person in that house who never once looked at Daniel the way the rest of them did, and that was my granddaughter, Lily. Daniel married a wonderful woman named Sarah when he was 28, a nurse, steady and warm and entirely unimpressed by Whitfield money, which endeared her to me instantly and horrified my father just as fast. Lily was born 2 years later, and from the moment that child could talk, she thought her father hung the moon. She didn't care that Grandpa Preston's house had a chandelier bigger than her bedroom. She cared that her daddy could lift her onto his shoulders and that his hugs smelled like the inside of his squad car, coffee and vinyl, and something like safety. Lily is 8 years old now, and she is the reason I am telling you this story instead of simply carrying it, silently, to my own grave the way I carried so much else in that house. Because somewhere in the last several years, watching that little girl watch her father get quietly humiliated at every family gathering, I started to understand something my own fear had kept me from understanding for over 2 decades. My silence had a cost, and it wasn't only mine to pay. I didn't know it yet that Christmas Eve morning when I woke up in my father's guest wing, because yes, even at 64, in my father's house, I still slept in what he called the guest wing, as if I had never truly moved back at all, as if some part of him still wanted me to remember I was only there on his mercy. I didn't know that by nightfall, Everything I had spent 22 years accepting as simply the way things were would come apart in front of 40 witnesses in dress blues. But I did know something was different. My phone had buzzed at 6 that morning with a text from Daniel that read only, "Mom, something's happening tonight. Trust me and don't ask questions yet." Followed, 20 minutes later, by a second text. "Please make sure Lily is there before 8. I stared at that message for a long time over my coffee in the enormous marble kitchen my father was so proud of, and I felt something in my chest tighten the way it used to tighten in the apartment years ago, right before the phone would ring with news about Robert's shift running long. A mother learns to recognize the shape of an approaching storm long before the sky admits to it. I had no idea that morning just how right I was. Daniel had always been careful about what he told us of his work. In the beginning, I assumed it was ordinary policy, the kind of discretion any officer keeps around an open case. As the years went on, though, the silences grew longer and stranger. He'd disappear for stretches I couldn't account for. He stopped answering questions about his precinct with anything but a tired half-smile. Sarah, when I asked her gently once, just shook her head and said, "That's between him and his captain, Eleanor. I've learned not to push." There was a night, about 4 months before that Christmas Eve, when I stopped by his house to drop off a casserole and found him sitting at his kitchen table at 11 at night with a stack of manila folders in front of him, thick as a phone book, and a duffel bag by the door that had clearly been packed and unpacked more than once. He closed the folders the instant he saw me in the doorway. Not guiltily, carefully. The way you'd close a book you didn't want a child to see the cover of. "Since when do beat cops get assigned reading like that?" I'd asked, trying for lightness. "I haven't been a beat cop in a while, Mom," he said, and then, quieter, almost to himself, "You'd be surprised what they let a guy do when nobody's watching who he used to be." I didn't press him that night. I regret that now, a little. Not because I think he would have told me the truth, but because I think some part of him was testing the water, seeing if there was a version of his own family that might have asked the right question at the right moment. I failed that small test, the way I had failed so many larger ones. What I didn't know, what none of us in that gilded, glittering, ice-cold house knew, was that my son had spent the last 11 months embedded undercover inside a trafficking and arms network operating out of 3 warehouses along the river docks, working directly under the regional FBI Joint Task Force, reporting to a police commissioner who had handpicked him personally for the assignment because of a reputation Daniel had built over a decade that none of us at that table had ever once bothered to ask about. We didn't know that 4 weeks before Christmas, that operation had come to a head in a converted grain silo, with Daniel alone on comms for 6 minutes after his backup radio failed, making the call that pulled 11 hostages, 3 of them children, out through a service tunnel before the structure was breached. We didn't know that the story hadn't made the papers because the case was still sealed, still working its way toward federal indictments that a single leak could unravel. We didn't know any of it because we had never once asked him anything worth an honest answer. And Daniel, God love him, had learned a long time ago in that house that some truths simply were not safe to hand to people who had already decided what he was worth. That's the man my family sent to eat his Christmas Eve dinner alone on a porch in 31-degree weather off a paper plate, while 40 officers were already, at that very hour, quietly assembling 3 miles away, waiting for a signal. None of us saw it coming. But I promise you, every single person in that house was about to. The days leading up to that Christmas Eve were, on the surface, almost aggressively ordinary, and that is precisely what should have unsettled me more than it did. My father had spent the better part of the autumn in a state of barely suppressed excitement because he was, for the first time in his 71 years, one confirmation vote away from a federal judicial nomination. A lifetime appointment, the crown jewel of a career built on decades of careful donations and carefully cultivated friendships. The confirmation hearing was scheduled for the second week of January, and my father had decided, with the precision of a general planning a campaign, that this Christmas Eve dinner would double as an unofficial audition, a chance to parade the family's respectability in front of the very people whose good opinion he needed. Among the guests he'd invited that year was a name that meant nothing to me at the time, and would come to mean everything within a matter of hours. Commissioner Alvarez, the newly appointed head of the Metro Police Oversight Board. A woman my father had courted for months, believing she might smooth his path with certain city officials whose endorsement he needed. He had invited her, ironically, entirely unaware that the very department she oversaw had spent the last 11 months quietly protecting his own grandson's undercover identity. The irony of that would not become clear to any of us until much, much later in the evening. My sister Vivian, meanwhile, had thrown herself into her usual holiday choreography. The caterers, the ice sculptures, the little place cards written in gold calligraphy ink that she reprinted twice because the first batch used the wrong shade of cream. Her son Chip, 31 years old and freshly announced as a candidate for city council, had become insufferable in the particular way only a Whitfield male chasing public office can become insufferable. He had opinions, suddenly, about law and order and cleaning up the precincts, delivered at every family gathering with the confidence of a man who had never once had to rely on the people he was describing. He did not know his own cousin was one of them. None of them did. I remember sitting in the kitchen 2 days before Christmas, half listening to Vivian fuss over seating arrangements, when she said, without any particular malice, in the tone you'd use to discuss where to seat a difficult aunt, "I really don't think Daniel should sit at the main table this year, Eleanor. Not with Commissioner Alvarez there. It just sends the wrong signal, doesn't it? Having, well, you know, that kind of profession represented next to Chip's announcement." I should have said something. I want you to know that I understand that now, fully, without excuse. But 22 years of practiced silence does not undo itself in a single kitchen conversation. And so what I said instead was some watered-down, cowardly version of, "I'll talk to Father about it," which both Vivian and I understood, in the way people understand things they'd rather not examine too closely, meant nothing would change at all. That same afternoon, a courier delivered an envelope to the house, thick cream stock embossed with a city seal, addressed not to my father, not to Vivian, but to Sergeant Daniel R. Hargrove, care of the Whitfield residence, because someone in a city records office had pulled an old emergency contact listing that still had this address on file from years ago. The housekeeper set it on the hall table with the rest of the mail, unopened, unremarked upon, one more envelope in a pile of Christmas cards. I found it that evening while sorting through invitations for the seating chart, and something about the return address, the Office of the Police Commissioner, printed in small official type beneath the seal, made my hands go still. I want to be honest with you. I opened it. I am not proud of that. But I have spent this entire story being honest with you about my failures, and I intend to keep doing so, even here. Inside was a single typed letter, formal in its language, but unmistakable in its meaning. It confirmed, in careful bureaucratic phrasing, the appointment of Sergeant Daniel R. Hargrove to the position of Deputy Chief of Police, effective immediately, pending a formal commendation ceremony to be held, and here my breath actually caught in my throat, on the evening of December 24th, at a location to be confirmed with the family of the honoree, in recognition of extraordinary valor during Operation Waterline. The letter went on for 2 more paragraphs after that, in the flat, careful language government offices reserve for things too large to say plainly. It referenced a badge number I didn't recognize, though I understood, with a small jolt, that it must be new, issued fresh, separate from whatever number he'd carried as a sergeant for the last decade. It referenced a case file, sealed under a number and a set of initials that meant nothing to me standing there in that hallway, though I would come to know that number the way you come to know a scar on your own hand, simply from staring at it long enough. And it referenced, in a single dry sentence near the bottom of the page, a joint federal and municipal task force operating in coordination with agencies whose names cannot be disclosed pending unsealing, which I read 3 times before I understood that my son had spent the better part of a year working alongside people the government itself was not yet willing to name out loud. I stood very still in that hallway for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly in my hands, though I told myself it was only the draft from the front door, some cold current slipping in under the old oak frame the way it always did in December. It wasn't the draft. I knew that even as I told myself the lie. My hands were shaking because some part of me, some old and buried part that had spent 22 years teaching itself not to hope for very much, had just been handed proof that everything I'd quietly suspected about my son, that he was better than this house had ever allowed him to be, that his quiet was not emptiness but discipline, had been true the entire time. I had simply never had the evidence in my hands before. Now I did, and it weighed considerably more than a single sheet of cream stock had any right to weigh. I thought, standing there, of a phone call I'd nearly forgotten, from 8 months earlier, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when my own cell phone had rung with a number I didn't recognize, a Washington exchange, and a clipped, unfamiliar voice had asked only whether I was the mother of Daniel Hargrove, and whether I could confirm an address for verification purposes before thanking me and hanging up without another word. I had assumed at the time that it was some kind of scam, the sort of thing you're warned about on the evening news, and I'd mentioned it to no one, not even Daniel, embarrassed at having answered at all. Standing in that hallway with the letter in my hand, I understood, with a small, cold drop in my stomach, exactly what that call had actually been. Somewhere in a federal building I would never see, someone had been quietly confirming that the man they were about to entrust with 11 lives in a converted grain silo had a mother who still lived at a fixed, verifiable address. I had been vetted. I simply hadn't known it. There was another memory that surfaced then, too, one I'd carried for nearly a year without ever once examining it closely, the way you carry a stone in your coat pocket long after you've forgotten picking it up. Daniel had come to Sunday dinner one evening in the early spring with a thin, white line of scar tissue along his forearm, just below the rolled cuff of his shirt, new enough that it still looked slightly raw at the edges. When I'd asked about it, he'd only shrugged and said something about a training exercise gone sideways, a piece of equipment that had caught him wrong, and I remembered thinking at the time only that it seemed like an unusually specific injury for routine training. I hadn't pressed. I had learned over the years exactly how far Daniel's patience extended when it came to questions about his work, and I had, as I always did, chosen the path of least friction. I understood now, holding that letter, that the scar likely had nothing whatsoever to do with training, and everything to do with whatever had actually happened inside Operation Waterline, and that my son had sat at my table eating pot roast with a wound from something I would never fully know the details of, and had smiled and asked about my garden, because that was who he had always been. A man who carried the weight of his real life quietly, so the people around him never had to feel the size of it. I thought, too, of something Vivian had said only that same week in passing, The kind of comment she tossed off so casually she likely didn't remember saying it an hour later. She'd mentioned, while going over the seating chart, that Chip's firm had picked up a lovely new client that spring. Some import business, shipping containers, very hush-hush, very lucrative, and that Chip had been positively glowing about the retainer for months. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Vivian was always announcing some new marker of Chip's success, the way other people announce the weather. But standing in that hallway with a federal letter in my hand, referencing a sealed case and an undisclosed task force, something about the phrase shipping containers settled into me with a weight I didn't yet have the full shape of. I did not know that night that I was already holding two separate threads of the same rope. I would understand it fully only weeks later, when Detective Ortiz stood on that porch with his tablet and Chip's wine glass shattered on the frozen brick. But some part of me, some quiet, uneasy part, filed the thought away that night the way you file away a name you suspect you'll need again. The house was warm and loud behind me, laughter and the clink of good crystal drifting from the kitchen where Vivian was directing the caterers through a final run of the menu. And I remember standing in that cold hallway feeling, for just a moment, entirely outside my own family, the way Daniel must have felt at every holiday for the last 2 decades. It is a strange and specific loneliness, standing in a house full of people who share your last name, and realizing you are the only one holding a piece of information that could reorder every single one of their lives, and choosing, for just a little longer, to say nothing at all. I thought about my father then, too, upstairs somewhere pressing a shirt for the following night's dinner, rehearsing, I had no doubt, some version of the smooth, self-satisfied speech he intended to deliver to Commissioner Alvarez the moment she walked through his door. He had spent months courting her good opinion, without the faintest idea that the woman he hoped would smooth his path to a federal bench had spent that same stretch of time signing off on the very operation that had kept his own grandson alive in a warehouse full of armed men none of us would ever meet. There is an irony in that so precise, so exquisitely constructed that I don't think I could have invented it myself if I had tried. Life, it turns out, occasionally writes better justice than any of us are capable of imagining on our own. I folded the letter back along its original creases, my fingers steadier now than they had been a few minutes earlier, and I slid it back into its envelope. And I stood there a moment longer, simply breathing, in the particular hush of a hallway lit only by the soft glow of a chandelier and the flicker of candles Vivian had already set along the mantel for effect. Somewhere above me, the grandfather clock that had stood in that hallway since before I was born ticked on with its slow, indifferent rhythm. The same rhythm it had kept through every quiet cruelty this house had ever witnessed, through every holiday my son had spent at the far end of a table that was never truly his, through the funeral of a father he barely remembered, and the years of silence that followed it. I did not yet know what I intended to do with what I now held. I only knew, standing there, that some threshold had quietly been crossed, the kind you don't recognize as a threshold until you're already standing on the other side of it, looking back at the version of yourself who still believed peace and silence were the same thing. I read that letter 4 times standing alone in that hallway, the grandfather clock ticking behind me like a held breath. I read that letter 4 times standing alone in that hallway, the grandfather clock ticking behind me like a held breath. My son. My quiet, overlooked, ridiculed son, who had been eating dinners at the far end of tables set by people who thought his badge was an embarrassment, was about to become the second highest-ranking police officer in the entire city. And someone, somewhere in that department, had decided the ceremony belonged here, in this house, on this night. I did not understand yet why. I would understand within hours. I called Daniel that night, my hand actually trembling as I dialed. He picked up on the second ring, and I could hear in the background the particular hum of a room full of people. Voices, laughter, something that sounded almost like a briefing. "Mom," he said, careful, the way he'd sounded as a boy, admitting to something before I'd even asked. "You weren't supposed to see that yet." "Daniel." My voice cracked in a way I hadn't planned. "Deputy Chief, Waterline. What in God's name have you been doing for the last year?" There was a long pause on his end, long enough that I could hear him exhale slowly, the way his father used to before saying something he'd been holding on to for too long. "Something I couldn't tell you about, Mom. Not because I didn't trust you, because telling you would have put people's lives at risk, including yours, if the wrong person heard it secondhand at one of Grandpa's dinner parties. You understand that, right?" I told him I understood. What I didn't say, not yet, was that I finally understood something larger than the operation itself. I understood that my son had spent his entire adult life building a version of himself so quietly extraordinary that even his own family, the people who were supposed to know him best, had no idea who he had actually become. He had built it alone, in silence, the way his father used to walk into burning buildings alone. Because some men simply do the hardest things without waiting for anyone's permission or approval. "The ceremony," I said. "Why here? Why Grandpa's house, of all places, tonight?" Another pause, and then, quiet, almost gentle. "Because Commissioner Alvarez asked where my family would be gathered on Christmas Eve." And I told her the truth. I told her my family gathers at my grandfather's house, and that I usually end up eating outside. She didn't think that was right, Mom. She said if the department was going to honor me, it should happen in front of the exact people who never thought I was worth honoring in the first place. I sat down hard on the bottom stair of that enormous marble staircase, and for the first time in 22 years inside that house, I felt something other than fear or duty or quiet accommodation. I felt something that had been buried so long I almost didn't recognize its shape anymore. I felt hope. Sharp, unfamiliar, almost painful hope. "What do you need me to do?" I asked him, and I meant it as more than a question. I meant it as an apology I didn't yet know how to phrase any other way. "Just be there," he said. "And Mom, don't let them keep Lily inside past 8:15. She should see this from the beginning, not the middle." I promised him I would. And then I sat alone on that staircase for a long time after we hung up, holding a letter that would end my father's political career, expose my nephew's carefully hidden sins, and finally, after 2 decades, put my son exactly where he had always belonged. Not at the far end of anyone's table, but at the head of his own. I just didn't yet know how much would have to burn down first to get us there. The 4 days between that phone call and Christmas Eve itself were, without question, the strangest of my entire life, because I spent them behaving as though nothing at all had changed, while carrying inside me a secret large enough to level the very foundations of the house I was standing in. I have thought about that stretch of time often since, and I've come to understand it as its own kind of undercover work, my own small amateur version of the discipline my son had practiced for 11 months straight. I learned, in those 4 days, exactly what it costs a person to hold still while everything around them keeps moving as though the ground isn't already cracking beneath their feet. I called Daniel's captain, a steady, soft-spoken man named Ruiz. No relation to the commissioner, as it turned out, though the coincidence of the surname briefly threw me. and asked, as delicately as I could manage, what exactly I needed to do to help without accidentally ruining whatever careful machinery had already been set in motion. Captain Ruiz laughed, not unkindly, and told me the machinery had names and ranks and 11 months of paperwork behind it, and that my only job, truly, was to make certain Lily was standing on that lawn by 8:15, and that I did not, under any circumstances, let my father cancel or relocate the dinner. "He won't cancel it," I told the captain, with a bitterness that surprised even me. "My father has never canceled an opportunity to be looked at in his life." That turned out to be the truest thing I said all week. I spent that first evening after the phone call, sitting alone in the dark of my bedroom for a long while, simply turning the whole shape of it over in my mind. Because I understood, even then, that knowledge like this could not simply be held. It demanded a decision. You cannot carry a secret the size of a deputy chief appointment and a sealed federal case through 4 days of holiday preparations without that secret eventually asking something of you. And what it asked of me, almost immediately, was to decide exactly how much I was willing to risk in order to see it through properly. The house around me, in those 4 days, carried on with an obliviousness that felt almost surreal to witness from the inside. My father spent long stretches locked in his study with his campaign advisor, a sharp, humorless woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who arrived each morning with a leather portfolio and left each evening looking faintly more exhausted than the day before, rehearsing answers to questions the confirmation committee might ask him in 3 weeks' time. I passed his study once, the door left slightly ajar, and heard him practicing a line about the sanctity of public trust, in the same smooth, unhurried voice he used for everything, entirely unaware that the sanctity of his own household had already been quietly compromised by choices he had made decades earlier and never once reconsidered. I remember standing in that hallway for a moment longer than I needed to, listening to him rehearse virtue he had never actually practiced, and feeling something colder than anger settle into my chest. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something closer to inevitability. The specific stillness of watching weather roll in that you already know cannot be stopped. Vivian, meanwhile, had thrown herself even more fully into the theater of the evening ahead, adding, on the second day, an ice sculpture consultation that ran nearly 90 minutes, and revising the seating chart no fewer than 3 separate times, each revision seemingly designed to maximize the visible distance between Daniel's usual place at the table and the guests she considered important enough to protect from proximity to him. I watched her lay out place cards on the dining room table that afternoon, each one written in that careful gold calligraphy she'd commissioned specially. And I noticed, with a small, bitter twist in my stomach, that she had not written one at all for Daniel. Not even for the porch. As though at some point over the years, my son's presence in that house had become so entirely assumed to exist outside the boundaries of formal consideration that a place card for him had simply stopped occurring to her as necessary. There was a moment on the second afternoon when I very nearly told my father everything. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to understand how close I came to losing my nerve entirely. I found him alone in his study that evening, reviewing notes for his hearing, and something in me softened, the way it always had for 64 years whenever I stood in a room alone with him, some old, deep-rooted instinct toward reconciliation that no amount of accumulated cruelty had ever fully burned out of me. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, the letter's contents sitting heavy behind my ribs, and I thought about simply telling him, warning him, giving him some small chance to soften the blow that was coming, the way a kinder daughter might have done. He looked up at me, distracted, mildly irritated at the interruption, and said only, "Did you need something, Eleanor?" in the particular tone he reserved for moments when my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought of Daniel eating alone on that porch for 22 consecutive years, of that same smooth voice delivering the phrase, "Failures eat where they belong," as though it were an act of mercy rather than cruelty. Of Lily's small, confused face the last time she'd asked why her father wasn't allowed to sit inside. And I found, standing in that doorway, that whatever softness had drawn me there in the first place simply could not survive contact with the memory of my own son's patience being tested for over 2 decades by a man who had never once had to examine his own conduct in return. "No," I told him. "Nothing at all." And I closed the door quietly behind me. And I did not open it again for the rest of that week. It was that evening, walking back down that long hallway past the portraits of Whitfields going back 4 generations, that I understood something with a clarity I had never quite possessed before. Silence, I realized, is not neutral. I had spent over 2 decades believing that my quiet was a kind of peacekeeping, a gentle cushioning between my father's cruelty and my son's dignity, when in fact, my silence had simply been another brick in the wall my father had spent his whole life building around what he considered acceptable. Every time I said nothing, I had been agreeing with him, in the only language that house had ever truly understood. And every time Daniel had absorbed one more slight without complaint, some part of that same silence had been teaching him that even the people who loved him most would rather keep the peace than defend him. I thought, too, about the particular loneliness Daniel must have carried through this house for over 2 decades. A loneliness I understood now, standing in that hallway myself, in an entirely new and uncomfortable way. There is a specific kind of isolation that comes from being surrounded by people who share your blood and your history and your last name, and still somehow feeling like an intruder in every room you enter. I had lived inside that isolation myself, in smaller doses, ever since I'd married a man my father considered beneath us. But I understood, finally, that whatever I had endured over the years, I had at least always had the comfort of knowing I could, if I chose, simply agree with my father and be welcomed fully back inside. Daniel had never had that option. His crime, in my father's eyes, was not a single decision he could reverse. It was the entire shape of who he had chosen to become. And no amount of quiet compliance on his part would have ever earned him a genuine place at that table. Only a slightly less humiliating spot outside it. That realization settled something in me that had been unsettled for 22 years. I understood, finally, standing alone in that hallway with 4 days left before Christmas Eve, that I did not need my father's permission to act. And I did not need his understanding. And I certainly did not owe him the courtesy of a warning he had never once extended to my husband or my son. What I needed, I understood with a clarity that felt almost physical, was allies. People who already knew, or who could be trusted the moment they did. People who would stand beside me rather than simply watch, the way I had watched for far too many years. In the meantime, I began, very quietly, to gather what allies I could. In the meantime, I began, very quietly, to gather what allies I could. I called Sarah first, Daniel's wife, and found her already halfway briefed, already steady in the particular calm of a woman who has spent a decade married to a man who runs toward danger for a living. "I've known for 3 days," she told me over the phone, her voice thick. "I wanted to tell you, Eleanor, but Daniel asked me not to. He said if even one more person knew before it was locked down, the whole surprise, the whole point of it, might get back to your father before it was supposed to." The point of it, she added, gentler now, was never really about the medal. He told me that himself. It was about your father finally seeing him. In front of everyone your father has ever tried to impress. I understood that instinctively, the way you understand a wound by the shape of the scar it eventually leaves. My father had spent 22 years making Daniel small in front of an audience. Somewhere, someone in that police department, someone who clearly loved my son enough to notice exactly the kind of humiliation he'd endured, had decided the correction needed to happen in exactly the same theater. I spent an evening quietly assembling small things Daniel would need, without knowing precisely why I was gathering them, only that some instinct told me to be ready. I found, tucked in the back of my closet, the small wooden box that held Robert's old badge, the one Daniel had worn on a string to his father's funeral at 12 years old, before the department had it properly mounted and returned to us in a glass case. I wrapped it carefully in a cloth and set it in my handbag. Some part of me knew, without being told, that this night would need his father's presence in it somehow, even if only in the shape of a small brass shield in my purse. I also, on the second day, made a decision that frightened me more than almost anything else in this entire story. I decided not to warn my father. Not out of some grand strategic cunning, though I understand now it functioned exactly that way. I decided it because I was, for the first time in over 2 decades, choosing my son's dignity over my father's comfort, and the terror of that choice sat in my stomach like a stone the entire week. I want to pause here and tell you something honestly, because I think it matters more than the drama of what came later. Choosing your child over the family that raised you, especially when that family holds your house, your security, your entire sense of belonging in its hands, is one of the hardest and loneliest decisions a person can make. I do not say that lightly. For 22 years, I told myself I was protecting Daniel by keeping the peace, by softening my father's cruelty into something bearable, by absorbing the sharp edges myself so they wouldn't cut as deep by the time they reached him. What I had actually been doing, I understood now, sitting alone in my father's guest wing at midnight with a badge wrapped in cloth in my handbag, was teaching my son that his own mother would always, eventually, choose comfort over him. I thought that night of something I had not allowed myself to think about in years. A dinner far older than this one, back when Robert was still alive. Back when my father had only just begun softening us both into the shape of guests rather than family. It was our 5th wedding anniversary, and Robert, against every instinct he had, agreed to let me host a small celebration at my parents' house, because I had asked him to, because some part of me still believed in those early years that enough good behavior might eventually earn us a real place at that table. My father had raised a toast that evening, too, the way he always did, full of warm, generous-sounding words about family and loyalty. And then, almost as an aside, almost gently, he had asked Robert what exactly a patrolman's pension looked like these days, and whether Robert had given any real thought to a safer line of work now that he had a wife with expectations to consider. I remember the silence that followed. I remember Robert's jaw working once, just once, before he answered evenly that he had given quite a lot of thought to it, and that he had decided the work mattered more to him than the pension did. My father had smiled at that, the same smooth smile I would come to recognize over the following decades as the exact shape his cruelty always wore, and said only, "Well, someone has to do it, I suppose," in a tone that made it clear he did not believe that someone needed to be anyone he considered family. I had said nothing that night. I want you to understand that clearly, because I think it is the root of everything that came after. I sat beside my husband while my own father questioned his worth in front of a room full of people, and I said nothing, because I told myself it was easier, because I told myself Robert didn't need me to defend him, because I told myself 100 small, comfortable lies that all amounted to the same cowardice. Robert never once asked me to say something. That was the worst part, in a way. He simply absorbed it, the way he absorbed everything, quietly, without complaint, and drove us home that night with his jaw still tight, and never mentioned it again. I only understood, decades later, sitting in that same house with a badge wrapped in cloth in my handbag, that his silence had never meant it didn't wound him. It had only meant he had learned, long before I had, that some fights were not worth having with people who had already decided the verdict before the argument began. I saw now, with a clarity that arrived almost too late to matter, that Daniel had learned that same lesson from his father, and that I had spent 22 years teaching him the second half of it myself, teaching him, through my own silence, that even his mother would rather keep the peace than defend him. I had told myself, for so long, that I was protecting him. I understood now that I had simply been repeating the exact failure I had committed against his father, at a different table, with a different generation watching. I picked up my phone again that night, well past 11, and called Captain Ruiz a second time, my voice steadier now than it had been 3 days earlier. "I want to understand exactly what's going to happen," I told him. "Not the broad strokes. I want to understand the timeline, minute by minute, so that when it happens, I am not standing there confused like everyone else in that house." There was a pause on his end, and then, I think, something like respect entered his voice, because he began walking me through it with the same precision Daniel used when he explained things to Lily, patiently, without condescension, trusting me to hold the weight of it. The convoy, he explained, would stage 3 miles from my father's estate, at a firehouse the department used for exactly this kind of discreet assembly, and would depart at exactly 7:58, timed to arrive at 8:14, which would give Commissioner Alvarez enough margin to have already positioned herself among the dinner guests without drawing early suspicion. 40 officers had volunteered for the honor detail, he told me, more than the department had originally planned for, because word had traveled quietly through 3 precincts about what Daniel had actually done in that grain silo, and because, as Ruiz put it, there are a lot of people in this department who've been wanting a reason to show up for that man for a long time now, ma'am. This just happened to be the first time we were allowed to. I had to set the phone down for a moment when he said that, because I found I could not immediately speak past the tightness in my throat. He told me, too, about the medal itself, the Medal of Valor, its citation already drafted and reviewed by 3 separate review boards, its presentation folder already prepared with commendation language that used words like extraordinary and unwavering and beyond the reasonable expectation of duty. Words I would hear spoken aloud on that porch only days later, but which I first encountered that night as dry administrative phrases read to me over a telephone line at nearly midnight, each one landing in my chest like a small, precise blow. I asked him, quietly, whether Daniel knew the full extent of what was being said about him in those reviews, and Ruiz said, "No, ma'am, he's never once asked. That man does not do this work to be told how good he is at it. He does it because somebody has to, and he's decided it might as well be him." It was, I remember thinking, almost exactly the same sentence Robert had once used at that anniversary dinner, decades earlier, delivered in nearly the same quiet, unbothered tone. Some things, it seems, pass down through blood in ways no family dinner can erase, no matter how hard certain people try. I asked him one final question before we hung up, one that had been sitting under my ribs since I first read that letter in the hallway. I asked him why the department had chosen my father's house at all, rather than a precinct hall or city hall, or any of the dozen more logical venues a ceremony like this might have used. Ruiz was quiet for a moment, and then he said, gently, "Honestly, ma'am, that part wasn't the department's call. Commissioner Alvarez asked for it specifically. She said if a man's own family spent over 20 years telling him he wasn't good enough to sit at their table, then that family had earned the right to watch, up close, exactly what they'd been wrong about. She said it felt like the only venue that would actually mean something." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you found and aren't yet sure whether to keep. The following afternoon, I drove to Daniel and Sarah's house under the pretense of dropping off a casserole dish I genuinely did not need to return, and found Daniel in the driveway, half underneath the hood of that old truck of his, grease on his forearms, looking for all the world like a man with nothing more urgent on his mind than a stubborn carburetor. I stood beside him for a while without saying anything, watching him work, and I found myself thinking about all the years I had watched him from a careful distance, always slightly outside the frame of his real life, the way the rest of the family had trained me to stand. "You don't have to protect me from this anymore," I told him finally, and he straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in years, something cautious, something almost hopeful. "I know what's coming Christmas Eve," I said. "I know about the medal. I know about the promotion. And I want you to know that whatever happens in that house tonight, whatever your grandfather says, whatever Vivian does, I am not standing on his side of the room anymore. I haven't been standing on your side nearly often enough, and I am sorrier for that than I know how to say properly. But I am done apologizing for it in half measures. I am simply going to be there, standing beside you, the way I should have been standing beside your father 30 years ago." Daniel didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at me. And then he reached out and pulled me into a hug that smelled exactly the way it always had when he was small, like engine grease and something steady underneath it. And he said, quietly, into the top of my head, "It's not too late, Mom. It was never too late. I just needed you to actually mean it. Once." I drove home from his house that evening with my hands steadier on the wheel than they had been in longer than I could remember. And I understood, finally, with none of the fear that had accompanied every other decision I'd made in that family for over 2 decades, exactly what needed to change, and exactly what I intended to do about it. Not this time. On the 3rd day, Vivian cornered me in the pantry, going over her seating chart one final time, and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she'd decided, for simplicity really, nothing personal, that Daniel would be more comfortable eating on the back porch this year, given how crowded the main table would be with Commissioner Alvarez and 2 city councilmen and Chip's fiancé's parents, who were, apparently, quite particular about atmosphere. "He's family, Vivian," I said, quieter than I meant to, testing the words in my mouth like something that had gone slightly stale from disuse. "Of course he's family," she said, in the light, dismissive tone she'd perfected over decades of never once being challenged on anything. "But you know how Father feels about presentation, Eleanor. It's one night. He'll survive a plate outside." "He always does." I remember standing in that pantry, surrounded by crystal serving dishes worth more than the apartment Daniel and I had once shared with his father, and feeling something shift inside my chest. Not rage exactly, though rage was certainly present. Something colder and steadier than rage. Something closer to resolve. "You're right," I told her, and I watched her blink, surprised by my agreement. "He always does survive it." What I didn't say, what I let sit unspoken between us, a small, private cruelty of my own that I am not entirely ashamed of, was that this would be the very last time. By the morning of Christmas Eve itself, the house had transformed into the gleaming theater my father always insisted upon for his most important performances. Garland wound up the marble staircase in thick, fragrant coils. The dining table had been extended to its full length and dressed in white linen and gold candlesticks that had belonged to my grandmother. Vivian's caterers moved through the kitchen like a small, silent army, and my father, dressed already by 10 in the morning in a suit clearly chosen for a photograph rather than a family dinner, moved through the halls rehearsing, I am quite certain, the exact tone he intended to use when introducing himself to Commissioner Alvarez. I found Lily in the sitting room around noon, curled up with a book, and I sat beside her and asked, as casually as I could manage, whether she'd like to help me with something special that evening. Her whole face lit up, the way only an 8-year-old's face can, uncomplicated and instant. "Is it a surprise?" she asked. "The biggest one this family has ever had," I told her, and I meant it with my whole heart. Daniel arrived at 6:30, exactly on time, exactly as he had for years, in his own beaten-up truck, in plain clothes because that was, as far as any of us officially knew, all he had to wear, and carrying, as he always did, a small gift for Lily, and nothing at all for himself. He looked tired in a way I recognized now as something far heavier than ordinary fatigue. The particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 11 months holding an entire secret operation together with nothing but discipline and nerve, and who was about to walk, unarmed and unprotected, into the one room in the world where he had never once been given the benefit of the doubt. I watched him from the front window as he crossed the driveway, and for just a moment, before he reached the door, I saw him stop. Just stop, entirely still on the cold stone path, and look up at that enormous, glowing house the way a man looks at a mountain he has decided, one final time, to climb. Then he squared his shoulders the exact way his father used to before a difficult shift, and walked inside. None of us, not my father, not Vivian, not Chip preening in his new tailored suit, not even I, despite everything I already knew, had any real idea what was about to happen in that house before the night was through. Daniel walked through that front door at 6:32 that evening, carrying a wrapped gift for his daughter, and, though nobody else could see it, an entire year of secrets that were about to detonate directly beneath my father's feet. The dinner began exactly the way every Whitfield Christmas Eve had begun for as long as I could remember, with my father standing at the head of the table, glass raised, delivering a toast that was ostensibly about gratitude and family, and somehow, by its final sentence, always managed to circle back around to his own accomplishments. This year's version included a not-so-subtle nod toward new beginnings for this family in the public sphere, which everyone at the table understood to mean his confirmation hearing, and a warmer, more explicit toast to Chip, the next generation of Whitfield leadership, which drew applause from at least a dozen guests I barely recognized, business associates and donors, and the two councilmen Vivian had fussed over for weeks. Daniel stood near the doorway during all of this, Lily's small hand in his, waiting, the way he always waited, for someone to gesture him toward a seat that never quite materialized in time. I watched Commissioner Alvarez, a sharp, watchful woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing, glance at him once, curiously, and I wondered, with a small jolt, whether she recognized him at all, whether she'd ever actually seen a photograph, whether any part of the machinery in motion tonight depended on her placing his face before the ceremony began. I would learn later that she had recognized him instantly. She simply hadn't shown it. Commissioners, it turns out, know a thing or two about holding still. It was Vivian who finally addressed the matter of Daniel's seat, sweeping past him with a stack of extra napkins and saying, brightly, as though delivering wonderful news, "Oh, Daniel, sweetheart, we just don't have quite enough room at the main table tonight. You understand, with the councilmen and everything. But I had Consuela set you up a lovely little plate on the back porch, heaters and everything. It'll be cozy." I watched my son's face. I have spent 22 years watching that particular face absorb that particular kind of blow. And I want you to know that I have never once seen it change. Not a flicker, not a flinch. He simply nodded, said, "Thank you, Aunt Vivian," in a voice so level it could have been mistaken for indifference by anyone who didn't know him the way I did, and crouched down to Lily's height. "Daddy's going to eat outside for a little bit, Bug," he told her softly. "You go on and sit with your grandma, okay? I'll come find you soon." Lily's small face crumpled instantly, and it was, I think, the sight of my granddaughter's confusion, more than anything my father or Vivian had ever said to Daniel directly, that finally cracked something open in me that had stayed sealed for over 2 decades. "Why does Daddy have to eat outside?" she asked me, loud enough that at least 3 guests turned to look, and loud enough that I saw my father's jaw tighten from across the room. "Because some people in this house," I told her, quietly, carefully, choosing every word with more precision than I had chosen anything in years, "have not yet learned who your father actually is. But they're about to." My father, catching only the tail end of the exchange, decided this was the moment to assert himself, the way he always did whenever Daniel's presence threatened to disrupt the polish of an evening. He crossed the room, glass in hand, and delivered, to a small audience of guests who had no context whatsoever for what they were witnessing, the line he had been sharpening for 22 years, like a blade kept in a velvet case for exactly such occasions. I watched him cross that room the way you watch weather arrive, when you already know exactly what kind of storm it is going to be. He moved slowly, unhurried, the particular unhurried confidence of a man who has never once had to worry that a room might not wait for him to finish crossing it. His footsteps on that marble floor seemed, in memory, to carry a weight entirely disproportionate to an old man in a tailored suit holding a half-empty glass of scotch, Though I understand now that the weight I remember was never really in his footsteps at all. It was in what I already knew was coming, and in the particular dread of watching an inevitability approach at a pace slow enough to feel almost deliberately cruel. Conversation in the room had not yet fully quieted. Vivian was still murmuring something to one of the councilman's wives about the caterer's timeline. And somewhere near the bar, a small cluster of guests I didn't recognize were laughing at some joke I hadn't caught the beginning of. But I could feel the attention of the room beginning to bend, the way a room always does when its host moves through it with obvious purpose, drawing eyes the way a lit match draws them in a dark hallway. I saw Commissioner Alvarez's gaze shift toward my father first, sharp and unreadable, and then toward Daniel, still crouched at Lily's height near the French doors. And I understood, watching her face, that she had clocked exactly what was about to happen several seconds before I had fully accepted it myself. Lily's hand found mine, without either of us quite deciding it should, her small fingers curling tight around two of mine. And I remember glancing down at her upturned face, still streaked faintly with the tears she'd shed only moments earlier, and feeling something in my chest twist so sharply it nearly took my breath. She did not yet understand what was coming. She only understood, the way children always understand these things before they can name them, that the air in the room had changed, that something was about to happen that her small body had already begun bracing against. I thought, in that stretch of seconds, of every single time I had watched my father cross a room exactly like this one, glass in hand, aimed at my son. I thought of Daniel at 23, freshly graduated from the academy, badge still gleaming at his belt, hearing those same 5 words for the very first time, and absorbing them the way you absorb a blow you already suspected was coming. I thought of every Thanksgiving and every Easter and every birthday in between, the accumulated weight of 2 decades of that exact walk, that exact glass, that exact smile arriving like clockwork whenever my son's presence threatened to complicate the smooth surface of one of my father's evenings. I understood, watching him approach now, that I had spent 22 years treating this walk as weather, something to be endured, something beyond anyone's ability to prevent, when in fact, it had only ever been a choice my father made again and again, a choice nobody in that house had ever once had the courage to interrupt. Daniel straightened slowly from where he'd been crouched beside Lily, and I watched him do it with the same deliberate calm he brought to everything. No urgency in it, no visible bracing, simply the quiet, practiced stillness of a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that some things could not be stopped, and could only be endured with dignity intact. He did not look toward his grandfather as Preston approached. He looked, instead, toward me, just for a fraction of a second, and something passed between us in that glance that I have turned over in my memory many times since. Not quite an apology, not quite a plea, something closer to a quiet, resigned acknowledgement that we both already knew exactly how the next few seconds were going to unfold, because we had both watched them unfold in nearly identical fashion more times than either of us could count. My father stopped a few feet from Daniel, close enough that the assembled guests near the fireplace and the bar had, by now, fully turned to watch, sensing, the way crowds always seem to sense these things, that something worth witnessing was about to occur. He held his glass loosely, almost carelessly, the picture of a man completely at ease in his own home, completely certain of his own authority within it, completely unaware, and this is the detail I find myself returning to most often, even now, that the very authority he was about to wield so casually had, unbeknownst to him, already been quietly stripped from beneath his feet by a woman sitting 3 chairs down the table, who had spent the last several days learning exactly how little his good opinion would soon be worth. I felt Lily's grip tighten further around my fingers, and I found myself holding my own breath without quite deciding to, the way you hold your breath in the last seconds before a diver hits water. Some instinctive bracing against an impact you cannot prevent and can only watch land. Somewhere behind me, I heard the faint clink of Chip setting down his wine glass, angling himself for a better view, already anticipating, I imagine, the particular pleasure he always seemed to take in watching his cousin absorb one more small public humiliation without complaint. Vivian, beside him, had gone quiet at last, her earlier story about Chip's graduation trailing off unfinished. Her attention finally, fully, turned toward the scene unfolding near the French doors. I thought, in that final held breath before my father spoke, of Robert. I thought of him standing in this exact room decades earlier, absorbing a nearly identical cruelty about his pension and his prospects, with the same quiet stillness his son now wore like armor. I thought about how much I wished, standing there, that I had found my voice on that long-ago evening, that I had said something, anything in his defense, instead of sitting silently beside him while my own father dismantled his worth in front of a room full of witnesses. I could not undo that failure. I understood that clearly, watching my father draw one final breath before he spoke. But I could, I realized, choose differently this time, in this room, for this son. And the understanding of that choice settled into me with a strange, steadying calm, even as my father opened his mouth to deliver the line he had been sharpening, patiently, cruelly, for 22 consecutive years. He smiled first, that same smooth, terrible smile, the one that had never once, in my entire life, meant anything close to warmth. "Failures eat where they belong, Daniel," he said, smiling that same smooth, terrible smile, loud enough for the room, warm enough in tone that a stranger might have mistaken it for affection. "Failures eat where they belong, Daniel," he said, smiling that same smooth, terrible smile, loud enough for the room, warm enough in tone that a stranger might have mistaken it for affection. Several guests actually chuckled, uncertain what else to do with the discomfort in the air. Chip smirked into his wineglass. Vivian didn't even look up from her napkins. I watched Daniel's shoulders rise and fall once, slow, controlled, the exact breath his father used to take before walking into a room he knew would be difficult. "Yes, sir," he said. Nothing more, and he walked out through the French doors onto the back porch, into 31-degree air, carrying a paper plate Consuela had apologetically assembled for him, his own daughter watching him go with tears standing in her eyes. I sat back down at that enormous table, surrounded by crystal and candlelight and 40 years of my father's carefully curated respectability, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe now as a held breath finally beginning to release. Because I knew with absolute bone-deep certainty that in a matter of minutes, that phrase, "failures eat where they belong," was about to be handed back to my father in a form he could never, ever have anticipated. I checked my watch. 7:58. 17 minutes. Outside, through the frost-edged glass of the French doors, I could see Daniel sitting alone on the top porch step, his breath fogging in the cold air, a paper plate balanced on his knee, looking out at the dark lawn with the same stillness I imagine he carried through 11 months of an undercover operation none of us had known existed. He didn't look humiliated. That's the detail that stays with me most, even now. He looked patient, like a man who had learned, a long time ago, exactly how to wait out a storm he already knew the ending of. I want to tell you what those 17 minutes felt like from inside that dining room, because I have never in my life experienced anything quite like it. The particular vertigo of sitting in a room full of people laughing and toasting and congratulating themselves, all of them utterly unaware that the ground beneath their polished shoes was already scheduled to open. Vivian was midway through a story about Chip's law school graduation, embellishing it, as she always did, with details that grew more impressive with each retelling. Chip himself was leaning toward Commissioner Alvarez, with the particular confidence of a man angling for an endorsement he did not yet know he was about to desperately need for entirely different reasons. My father was holding court near the fireplace, gesturing toward the two city councilmen with the ease of a man who believed, correctly as far as he knew, that this was simply another evening of quiet, private triumph. I let my eyes drift to Commissioner Alvarez for a moment, seated with perfect composure near the head of the table, sipping her wine at exactly the pace of a woman with absolutely nowhere else to be. And I understood, watching her, that she was doing precisely what I was doing, counting the minutes in silence, giving away nothing, waiting for a clock only the two of us in that entire room could actually hear ticking. Once, just once, her gaze crossed mine down the length of that table, and something passed between us, small and wordless. The particular understanding that exists between two women who have both decided, independently, to stop pretending they don't already know how an evening is going to end. She did not smile. I did not either. We simply looked away again and returned to our roles. Two quiet conspirators hiding in plain sight among the crystal and the candlelight. Chip, meanwhile, had found a fresh audience in one of the councilman's wives, and was telling her, with the particular puffed-up confidence of a man who has never once had his numbers checked by anyone, about the extraordinary quarter his firm had just closed. "We picked up an import client this spring," he was saying, swirling his wine the way he'd clearly practiced in a mirror somewhere. "Shipping and logistics, very lucrative, very discreet. I can't say too much, obviously. Client confidentiality." And here he actually winked, as though discretion were a kind of achievement rather than, as I now understood with a cold, private certainty, the precise language men use when they are hiding something they very much hope nobody will ever ask them about directly. I thought of Detective Ortiz's tablet, still 3 miles away in a convoy I couldn't yet see, and I felt something almost like pity for Chip, sitting there so pleased with himself, so entirely unaware that the words leaving his own mouth were, in that exact moment, already being confirmed as evidence by people who would knock on his door within the week. My father, for his part, had moved on to describing, at length, to the two councilmen, the particular judicial philosophy he intended to bring to the federal bench, using words like integrity and unimpeachable character, with the total, unblinking confidence of a man who has never once had to examine either quality in himself. "The bench needs men who understand that reputation is not built," he was saying, one hand resting on the mantel behind him in a pose I recognized instantly from 100 childhood photographs. "It is inherited, and then it is protected, generation after generation, through discipline and standards." One of the councilmen nodded along seriously, entirely unaware that the very grandson currently freezing on the back porch, sent there under those exact standards, was about to become the single most decorated law enforcement officer either of them had ever personally met. I checked my watch again. 8 and 2 minutes. 12 minutes remained. I found, in that stretch of waiting, that time behaved strangely, the way it always does in the moments before something enormous. It moved both too slowly and far too quickly, each second dragging by while the whole of it somehow slipped away faster than I could hold on to it. I thought of Robert, oddly, in that stretch of waiting, the way you sometimes think of the dead at exactly the moments you most need their steadiness. I thought about how he used to describe the last minutes before a call went out, the particular quality of stillness that settles over a person right before something changes permanently. And I understood, sitting at that table, that I was finally, at 64 years old, learning to recognize that same stillness in myself. I glanced toward the French doors again, and I could just make out Daniel's silhouette against the porch light, still seated, still patient, his shoulders squared in that particular way his father's used to square before difficult shifts. I wondered, watching him, whether he had any sense at all of how close the convoy already was, whether some instinct trained into him over a decade of police work had already begun counting down the same minutes I was counting, or whether he was simply sitting there the way he had sat there for over 20 holidays, quietly enduring, expecting nothing, prepared for nothing more than another cold plate and another silent ride home. I hoped, fiercely, that some part of him already knew. I did not want him to be surprised in the same helpless way the rest of the room was about to be. I wanted him, if nothing else, to have this one moment of certainty, after 2 decades of never once being given the benefit of the doubt. Lily had grown restless beside me, tugging gently at my sleeve, whispering that she was cold and wanted to go check on her daddy, and I held her hand a little tighter and told her, softly, that we needed just a few more minutes, that something very important was about to happen, and that she needed to trust me the way she trusted her father. She looked up at me with the particular, solemn seriousness only children seem able to summon on command and said, "Is it the surprise, Grandma?" And I told her, "Yes, sweetheart, it is the surprise, the biggest one this family has ever seen, and to please just hold my hand a little longer." Vivian, oblivious to all of this, had moved on to describing the ice sculpture she'd commissioned for the dessert course. A swan, she explained at length, imported specially, hand-carved by an artist she'd found through a friend in the city. And I remember thinking, with a bitterness I did not entirely try to suppress, that my sister had spent more time and money on a block of frozen water than she had ever once spent considering what it might cost her own nephew to sit alone in the actual cold outside her dining room window. Small cruelties, I have come to understand, rarely announce themselves as cruelties at all. They arrive dressed as convenience, as simplicity, as nothing personal, the way Vivian had dressed hers only days earlier in that pantry. It is only much later, usually, that you see them clearly for what they always were. 8 and 9 minutes. 5 remained. I felt my pulse climbing steadily now, not with fear exactly, but with something closer to anticipation, the particular tightness in the chest that comes right before a held note finally resolves. I thought of every single holiday Daniel had spent at the edge of this family's attention, every quiet dismissal, every version of that same cruel phrase delivered with a smile, and I found, sitting there with Robert's badge warm against my palm through the fabric of my handbag, that I was no longer frightened of what came next. I was only impatient for it to arrive. I thought, too, in that final stretch of waiting, about all the years I had spent believing that my silence protected this family's peace, when in truth, it had only ever protected my father's comfort, at the direct expense of my own son's dignity. I understood, watching the second hand of that grandfather clock complete its slow, indifferent circuit one final time before the number that would change everything, that peace built on someone else's humiliation was never really peace at all. It was only quiet. And quiet, I had learned far too late in my life, is not the same thing as safety, no matter how many years you convince yourself otherwise. 8 and 13 minutes. 1 remained. I glanced once more toward the French doors, toward my son's still silhouette against the porch light, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, something rising in my chest that was not grief, and was not fear, and was not the old, familiar habit of accommodation I had worn so long it had come to feel like skin. It was pride. Sharp, sudden, entirely unfamiliar pride, arriving finally, 22 years too late, and all at once. And I sat at that table with my hands folded in my lap over my handbag, feeling the small, hard shape of Robert's badge through the fabric, and I watched the second hand of the grandfather clock in the hallway sweep slowly, mercilessly, toward the number that would change everything. And I sat at that table with my hands folded in my lap over my handbag, feeling the small, hard shape of Robert's badge through the fabric, and I watched the second hand of the grandfather clock in the hallway sweep slowly, mercilessly, toward the number that would change everything. At exactly 8:14, the first set of headlights swept across the frozen front lawn. I don't think anyone else noticed at first. The windows on that side of the house were heavy with drapes, and the guests were deep in their second round of wine. But I had been watching for it, waiting the way you wait for a held note in music you already know is about to resolve. And I saw it. That first pale wash of light sliding across the ceiling, followed by a second and a third, and then more than I could count, until the entire front of the house was bathed in a slow, steady pulse of white light, headlight after headlight after headlight, turning up the long driveway in a procession too orderly, too deliberate, to be anything but exactly what it was.
"What on earth?" Vivian said, mid-sentence, trailing off as she noticed the light finally too, her face turning toward the window with the first flicker of confusion I'd seen all night. I stood up. I don't remember deciding to stand. My body simply rose, the way you rise instinctively at the sound of a name you've been waiting your whole life to hear called. "Lily," I said, holding out my hand to my granddaughter, who looked up at me with wide, uncertain eyes. "Come with Grandma. There's something your daddy needs you to see." We walked together to the front hall, and through the tall windows flanking the door, we watched as the driveway filled, row by row, with black and white patrol vehicles, their light bars dark, their engines cutting to silence one after another in a discipline that felt almost military. Doors opened in unison. Officers stepped out. Not 2, not 5, but line after line of them, in full dress blues, brass buttons catching the porch light, until I counted, and stopped counting, somewhere past 30, because by then it no longer mattered exactly how many. It mattered only that they kept coming. By this point, the entire dinner party had abandoned the table. Guests crowded the front windows, wine glasses forgotten in hands, murmuring in a rising tide of confusion. My father pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his face doing something I had genuinely never seen it do before. A kind of blank, uncomprehending alarm. The expression of a man who has spent 71 years believing he controlled every room he ever entered, suddenly confronted with a scene he had absolutely no script for. "What in God's name is this?" he said, to no one, to everyone, his voice climbing toward a register I'd never heard from him. I didn't answer him. I simply opened the front door myself, stepped out onto the top of the porch steps with Lily's small hand tight in mine, and looked down at 40 officers standing in 2 perfect lines flanking the walkway. Every single one of them turned not toward the house,
not toward my father framed dramatically in the doorway behind me, but toward the far end of the porch, where my son sat frozen, paper plate still balanced on his knee, staring at the scene unfolding in front of him with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. Commissioner Alvarez stepped out from the crowd of guests behind me. She had slipped outside at some point without my noticing, and now she descended the porch steps with the calm, deliberate authority of a woman who had clearly planned every second of what came next. She walked past my father without so much as a glance, past Vivian, past Chip, straight down the walkway toward the assembled officers, and turned to face them, and then turned back toward the porch. "Deputy Chief Hargrove," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the frozen lawn, across the stunned silence of 40 guests pressed against the windows behind us. "On your feet, son." And in that moment, every single officer standing on that lawn, 40 men and women in dress blues, in the freezing December air, in front of a house that had spent 22 years insisting my son was an embarrassment, raised their right hands in perfect, simultaneous unison and saluted him. I felt Lily's hand tighten in mine. I heard, behind me, the sound of my father's champagne glass slipping from his fingers and shattering on the marble threshold. And I watched my son rise slowly from that cold porch step, paper plate falling forgotten to the ground, and stand at attention in front of 40 of his own, in front of the family that had told him for 2 decades exactly where he belonged. He belonged exactly here, it turned out, at the front of the line. None of us, not my father, not Vivian, not Chip, and if I am honest, not even I, despite everything I already knew, had the faintest idea just how far that line was about to be redrawn before the night was through. Commissioner Alvarez climbed the porch steps, and the crowd of stunned dinner guests parted around her the way water parts around a stone dropped into it. She stopped directly in front of Daniel, who stood at attention, jaw tight, eyes forward, in the exact posture I remembered his father holding at every academy ceremony decades ago. She held a slim leather folder in one gloved hand, and behind her, 2 officers I would later learn were part of the honor guard carried a small wooden case between them, the kind used for formal presentations of medals and commendations. 11 months ago, Alvarez began, her voice pitched to carry, deliberately, to every stunned face pressed against the windows of that house. Sergeant Daniel Hargrove volunteered for an assignment that 3 other officers, more senior and more decorated, had already declined. He went in alone, embedded, with no backup identity, no safety net beyond a single handler and a radio he wasn't always able to use. For 11 months, he lived a life none of his family, none of his friends, and frankly, very few people in this department were permitted to know anything about. I watched my father's face over Alvarez's shoulder, still frozen in the doorway, still processing, the shattered glass at his feet catching the porch light in small, glittering shards. 4 weeks ago, Alvarez continued, that operation reached its conclusion in a converted grain silo along the river docks, where Sergeant Hargrove's cover was blown 11 minutes before extraction. In the 6 minutes that followed, 6 minutes during which his primary radio failed, during which backup was still 4 minutes out, during which, by every reasonable standard, he should have waited for support that was not yet available, Sergeant Hargrove made the decision to move 11 hostages, 3 of them children under the age of 10, through a service tunnel he had scouted alone, on his own initiative, at extraordinary personal risk. She opened the leather folder. For that action, and for 11 months of service that this department did not, until tonight, have the legal ability to publicly acknowledge, the sealed case having closed as of 6 o'clock this evening, with the final indictments filed against the Kessler-Ruiz trafficking network. And here I heard Chip make a small, strangled sound behind me that I did not yet understand the significance of, though I would within the hour. It is my great honor to award Sergeant Daniel Hargrove the Department's Medal of Valor. And, effective as of this evening, to confirm his appointment as this city's next Deputy Chief of Police. The porch was silent, except for the wind moving through the bare trees, and somewhere behind me, the faint, unmistakable sound of my father sitting down hard on the marble bench beside the front door, as though his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him up. Alvarez pinned the medal to Daniel's chest herself, her hands steady, her expression carrying none of the theater of the moment, only a quiet, professional pride that told me, more than anything else that night, exactly how much my son had earned this. Then she stepped back, and to my astonishment, she turned to face not Daniel, but the crowd of guests still pressed against the windows, still crowding the doorway, still absorbing what had just happened on that porch. "I understand," she said, her voice carrying a new edge now, something almost surgical. "That Sergeant Hargrove, Deputy Chief Hargrove, as of tonight, has been eating his holiday dinners outside on this porch for some years now. Alone. In the cold." She let that sentence sit in the freezing air for a long moment.
I'd be curious to understand why a man this department considers one of its finest officers has apparently been considered, in his own family's house, unworthy of a seat at the table. Nobody answered her. Nobody could. My father remained seated on that bench, his face gone the color of the marble beneath him, and Vivian stood frozen with her hand pressed to her mouth. And Chip had gone somewhere beyond pale, somewhere closer to gray, and I understood now, watching him, that his reaction had nothing at all to do with Daniel. I stood there for a moment simply watching him, the way you watch a crack spread across ice before you're entirely sure whether it will hold your weight. Chip's hand had gone to the phone in his jacket pocket, an unconscious gesture, the kind of movement a person makes when their body understands danger a full beat before their mind catches up to it. And I saw him glance, quick and darting, toward the front door, toward the driveway beyond it, as though some part of him were already calculating the fastest route out of that house. His fiancée's parents, standing just behind him, exchanged a look I recognized instantly, the specific, wordless communication of people quietly recalculating how closely they wanted their daughter's name attached to this family by morning. The rest of the guests, meanwhile, had arranged themselves into the particular tableau of people who understand, on some instinctive level, that they are witnessing something they were never meant to see, and are torn between the impulse to look away out of decency and the impulse to keep watching out of an appetite for spectacle they would never admit to feeling. One of the councilman's wives had her hand pressed flat against her chest. Another guest, an elderly woman I recognized vaguely as a friend of my father's from the country club, had gone very still, her wine glass held at an odd, forgotten angle, as though she'd simply stopped remembering she was holding it. Snow had begun to fall, very lightly, drifting down through the porch light in slow, indifferent spirals, settling on the shoulders of the officers standing at attention, on the brim of Alvarez's cap, on the cold brick where Chip's shattered wine glass still lay in glittering pieces nobody had thought to sweep away. I looked at my father again, still seated on that marble bench, and I understood, watching his face, that some part of him had not yet caught up to the scale of what was happening. He looked, in that moment, like a man doing arithmetic he did not want to finish,
running the numbers again and again in the hope that a different sum might eventually present itself. His eyes moved from Daniel to the medal on Daniel's chest, to Alvarez, to the folder in her gloved hand, and then, finally, involuntarily, to Chip. And I watched something pass over my father's expression that I had never once seen there in 64 years of being his daughter. It was the particular helpless horror of a man realizing that the exact family reputation he had spent his entire life constructing, brick by careful brick, had been quietly undermined not by the grandson he'd scorned, but by the one he'd spent decades grooming and praising in his place. Vivian, for her part, had gone entirely silent, which was, in itself, more alarming than anything she might have said. I had never in my life seen my sister without a ready sentence, without some bright, deflecting remark designed to smooth an uncomfortable moment back into something manageable. And the sight of her standing frozen at the top of those porch steps, one hand still pressed to her mouth, told me more clearly than words could have that some part of her, too, understood exactly what was coming, even if she could not yet name it. She looked, I thought, very small standing there, smaller than I had ever once considered my older sister capable of looking. And for just a fraction of a second, I felt something almost like pity for her. It did not last. I want to be honest with you about that. The pity arrived, and then it left again almost as quickly, chased out by the memory of every single Christmas Eve she had cheerfully, casually, banished my son to that same cold porch, as though his comfort had never once been worth the inconvenience of rearranging a seating chart. Daniel himself had not moved, had not so much as glanced toward his cousin, though I suspect now, looking back, that some part of him already understood exactly what was coming as well. He had, after all, spent the better part of 11 months learning to read the small, unconscious tells of frightened, guilty men. The shifting weight, the quick glance toward an exit, the hand that keeps returning to a pocket as though checking that something is still there. I imagine he clocked every single one of those signals in Chip within the first 10 seconds of Alvarez's speech, the way you clock a familiar signature on a page you've read 100 times before. He simply chose, with the same discipline that had carried him through that grain silo 4 weeks earlier, to say nothing yet, to let the moment build at its own pace, to let the truth arrive exactly when it was ready to arrive, rather than rushing it forward out of anger he had every right to feel and chose not to spend. Lily, still holding tightly to my hand, tugged once, gently, and whispered up at me, "Why is Uncle Chip's face so white, Grandma?" And I found myself crouching slightly, keeping my voice low and steady, the way I imagine her father had learned to keep his voice low and steady, in rooms far more dangerous than this one. "Because sometimes," I told her, "the truth arrives for more than one person at the same time, sweetheart. And not everybody standing here tonight is going to like what it says about them." She considered that with the particular gravity children reserve for information they sense is important, even when they don't fully understand it. And then she simply nodded and turned her attention back to her father, standing tall now under the porch light with his medal catching the glow of it. And I thought, watching her watch him, that whatever else this night cost this family, it had at least given my granddaughter a memory of her father worth keeping for the rest of her life. I glanced toward Detective Ortiz, standing near the edge of the honor guard, and saw him watching Chip with the particular patient stillness of a man who has learned not to rush a confession.
The same stillness I imagine he'd used 100 times before in rooms far less decorated than this frozen porch. He did not reach for his tablet yet. He simply waited. The way a fisherman waits once he feels the first faint tug on a line he has already set, confident that the rest would come in its own time, without forcing it. I thought, standing there in the cold, with snow settling silently onto my shoulders, of every single dismissive comment Chip had made over the years about law and order, about cleaning up the precincts, delivered always with the specific confidence of a man who assumed the law was a thing that happened to other people, lesser people, people who had not been born with a Whitfield surname to shield them. I thought of the wire transfers Detective Ortiz had mentioned earlier that same week to Alvarez's staff. Numbers I did not yet fully understand the shape of, moving quietly between an escrow account and a shell company with a name that sounded almost deliberately unremarkable. I thought of Vivian's offhand comment in the kitchen about Chip's lovely new client, the shipping business, so lucrative, so discreet, and I understood, watching my nephew's face drain slowly of every last trace of color under that porch light, that I was about to learn exactly why discretion had mattered so very much to him. Alvarez let the silence stretch a moment longer, the particular deliberate silence of a woman who understood, better than almost anyone else standing on that lawn, that some truths land harder when they are allowed room to breathe before they are spoken aloud. She glanced once at Detective Ortiz, a small, economical nod, the same gesture I imagine passed between them 100 times over the course of whatever quiet, careful work had built toward this exact moment. And then she turned, not toward my father this time, not toward Daniel, but directly toward Chip, standing frozen at the edge of the crowd with his ruined glass still lying in pieces at his feet. I would understand exactly why within the next few seconds, and I do not think, even now, that I will ever forget the particular sound my nephew made when he finally did. It had everything to do with the words, Kessler Ruiz Trafficking Network, and the fact that Chip's own name, though none of us knew it yet, appeared in a financial ledger seized from that very operation 4 weeks earlier. A ledger that Daniel, in his new role, would have full and immediate access to within the week. It had everything to do with the words, Kessler Ruiz Trafficking Network, and the fact that Chip's own name, though none of us knew it yet, appeared in a financial ledger seized from that very operation 4 weeks earlier. A ledger that Daniel, in his new role, would have full and immediate access to within the week. But that particular collapse hadn't fully begun. Not yet. What happened next happened first. And it happened because my granddaughter, 8 years old, still holding my hand, chose that exact moment to let go of it, walk down the porch steps past 40 saluting officers, and wrap her arms around her father's legs, sobbing, "I knew it, Daddy! I always knew you were the bravest one." And it was that image, not the medal, not the salute, not even Alvarez's pointed question hanging unanswered in the cold air, that finally broke something loose in me completely. I walked down those steps myself, past the officers, past Alvarez, and I opened my handbag and drew out the small, cloth-wrapped box I had carried all week without fully understanding why. And I placed Robert's badge into my son's free hand. "Your father would be so proud of you," I told him, my voice breaking in front of 40 strangers and every member of my own family. "And I am so sorry it took me this long to say it out loud." Daniel looked down at that small brass shield in his palm, then up at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I saw something in his face other than careful, guarded patience. I saw relief. 22 years of it, finally, quietly, exhaling. Behind us, my father was still sitting on that marble bench,
and I watched Commissioner Alvarez turn back toward him with the deliberate calm of a woman who had clearly been planning this precise confrontation for longer than any of us realized. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, and her tone had shifted now, formal, almost clinical. "I believe you have a confirmation hearing in 3 weeks." My father managed to find his voice, though it came out thinner than I had ever heard it. "I do," he said. "I don't see what that has to do with—" "It has everything to do with it," Alvarez said, "because part of my board's oversight responsibility includes reviewing character references submitted in support of federal judicial nominees. I received a very glowing letter from you 2 weeks ago, Mr. Whitfield, describing your family's, and I quote, unwavering commitment to public service and law enforcement excellence." She let the folder in her hand fall open again, revealing what I now recognized as a copy of that very letter. "I found that an interesting claim tonight, watching your own grandson eat dinner alone on a porch step because you consider his profession beneath your table." The silence that followed was, I think, the loudest silence I have ever experienced in my entire life. Every guest at that window heard it. Both councilmen heard it. And somewhere in the back of that crowd, Chip Whitfield had gone quiet enough, still enough, that I finally understood, with the cold, clean clarity of a woman who had spent 22 years learning to read the small tells of frightened men, that his silence was not embarrassment on his cousin's behalf. It was fear for himself. And it was about to be entirely justified. The next several minutes unfolded with the particular chaos of a house realizing, all at once, that its foundations had been quietly hollowed out for weeks without anyone noticing the sound of the digging. Commissioner Alvarez, having delivered her verdict on my father's letter, turned to one of the officers behind her, a younger man I would later learn was Detective Ortiz, one of 2 colleagues who had run point on the financial side of the Kessler-Ruiz investigation, and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Ortiz stepped forward, produced a slim tablet from an inner coat pocket, and addressed Chip directly, his voice polite but utterly without warmth. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "given tonight's case closure, I've been authorized to inform you that the department will be following up formally regarding the 3 wire transfers made from your firm's escrow account to a shell entity registered under the name Kessler Maritime Holdings, dated between March and September of this year, totaling just over $218,000. Chip's wine glass, the same glass he had raised not 20 minutes earlier to toast his own city council announcement, slipped from his fingers and shattered on the frozen brick of the porch. A second time that night that glass had broken in that house, though this time nobody rushed to clean it up. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and what finally emerged was a stammered, That was a legitimate client transaction. I can explain." "You'll have every opportunity to explain," Ortiz said evenly. "At your deposition, which my office will be scheduling within the week." He tucked the tablet away with the calm efficiency of a man who had delivered this exact kind of sentence more times than he could count, and stepped back into formation. I watched Vivian's face during this exchange, and I want you to understand that whatever satisfaction I felt in that moment, and I will admit I felt some, I am human, and 22 years of quiet cruelty does not simply evaporate without leaving behind a small hunger for reckoning. It was tempered almost immediately by the sight of my sister realizing, in real time, in front of 2 city councilmen and a police commissioner, and 40 uniformed officers, that her son's political career, and possibly his freedom, had just ended in the space of 90 seconds.
Her hand found the porch railing. Her knees, I think, genuinely buckled, though Chip's fiancé's mother caught her elbow before she went down. My father, still seated on that marble bench, seemed to age a decade in the time it took Ortiz to finish speaking. He looked, for the first time in my entire life, small. Not powerful, not commanding, just an old man in an expensive suit, sitting alone on cold stone, watching every single thing he had spent 71 years building collapse in the span of a single Christmas Eve.
"Eleanor," he said, and his voice, when it finally found me, had none of its usual polish. It came out thin, almost pleading, a register I had genuinely never once heard from him in 64 years of being his daughter. "Eleanor, did you know about this? Any of this?" I looked down at him, this man who had told me I could marry the help if I wanted, who had spent 22 years erasing my husband from every family conversation, who had made my son eat alone in the cold so many times that I had lost count somewhere around year 8. And I found, to my own quiet surprise, that I felt no need to shout, no need for cruelty, no need to match 22 years of his coldness with a single degree of my own. "I found out 4 days ago," I told him, "and I decided, for the first time in my adult life, that your comfort was not more important than my son's dignity. I'm sorry it took me this long, Father. I'm not sorry about tonight." He had no answer for that. I don't think, in 71 years, anyone had ever spoken to him quite that plainly. And I watched something in his face fold inward. Not quite grief, not quite shame. Something closer to the particular bewilderment of a man discovering, very late in life, that the ground he'd been standing on was never as solid as he'd believed. Behind him, in the doorway, the 2 city councilmen were already exchanging quiet, uncomfortable glances, the specific body language of men calculating, in real time, how quickly they could distance themselves from a family whose name had just been publicly connected, on the same evening, to both a federal trafficking investigation and a documented pattern of humiliating a decorated police officer. One of them, a heavy-set man named Councilman Byrne, whom I vaguely recalled donating generously to my father's judicial campaign, actually took his coat from the hall closet himself, rather than wait for staff, murmuring something about an early morning, to no one in particular, and left without saying goodbye to my father at all. That, I think, was the moment my father truly understood the scale of what had happened. Not the medal, not the salute, not even Chip's unraveling. It was watching a $200,000 donor walk out of his house without a word of farewell, on the very night meant to seal a judicial nomination, that finally showed him exactly how thoroughly the evening had turned. Vivian, for her part, made one final, desperate attempt at damage control, turning to Commissioner Alvarez with the bright, brittle smile she had used to smooth over every uncomfortable moment for 30 years. "Commissioner, I do hope you'll stay for dessert. We have the loveliest—" "I think we're finished here for tonight, Mrs. Whitfield," Alvarez said, not unkindly, but with absolutely no room left for negotiation. "Though I imagine you'll be hearing from my office again soon, given the household's evident familiarity with certain financial arrangements." She let that hang, deliberately vague, deliberately unsettling, and I watched Vivian's face go through 3 distinct shades of alarm before finally settling on something close to defeat. Daniel, through all of this, had said remarkably little. He stood with Lily still wrapped around his legs, Robert's badge held tight in one fist, the Medal of Valor gleaming against his chest in the porch light, and he watched his grandfather sitting broken on that marble bench with an expression I can only describe as sorrow rather than triumph. That, I think, is the truest measure of the man my son had become. Even in the moment of his fullest vindication, he did not gloat. He did not deliver a single cutting remark. He simply watched, quietly, the way he had learned to watch everything, patient and precise, while the family that had spent 2 decades diminishing him finally, fully, understood exactly what they had been diminishing. It was Lily, in the end, who spoke the words that closed that particular chapter of the evening, tilting her small face up toward her great-grandfather with the guileless clarity only a child possesses. "Grandpa Preston," she said, "you said failures eat where they belong." She paused, working through the logic with the serious concentration of an 8-year-old solving a puzzle. "Where does my daddy belong now?" Nobody answered her for a long moment. Then Daniel, finally, quietly, spoke the only words he offered his grandfather all night. "Where I've always belonged, Bug," he said, looking not at Lily, but directly at Preston Whitfield, his voice as level and unshaken as it had been the moment his grandfather first delivered that cruel little phrase 22 years ago. "At the front of the line. I just had to wait a long time for the rest of this family to notice." I do not think my father slept at all that night. I know this because I did not sleep either, and I heard him, well past 2 in the morning, moving slowly through the halls of that enormous house, alone, the way a man moves through a building he no longer entirely recognizes as his own. The weeks that followed unfolded with a swiftness that still, even now, astonishes me when I think back on how slowly the previous 22 years had crawled by comparison. My father's judicial confirmation, scheduled for the 2nd week of January, was quietly withdrawn from consideration 9 days after that Christmas Eve dinner. Not through any formal scandal announcement, but through the slow, deliberate erosion of support that happens when the right people in the right rooms decide a nomination has become more trouble than it's worth. Commissioner Alvarez, I later learned, had submitted a formal statement to the Judicial Oversight Committee regarding concerns about character and family conduct inconsistent with the nominee's stated values. And in Washington, as in that dining room, reputation is a fragile architecture. Once the cracks show, the whole structure tends to follow. Chip's situation resolved rather more publicly and rather less kindly. The financial investigation into those wire transfers expanded over the following 2 months into a broader case involving 3 other associates at Whitfield and Cole. And though Chip himself ultimately avoided the most serious charges through a plea agreement, cooperation, restitution, 5 years of supervised probation, and a permanent disbarment that ended any hope of the political career he'd announced so proudly at that Christmas Eve table, the damage to the family name was, by then, already thoroughly done. He withdrew his city council candidacy the following week, citing personal matters, and I understand he and his fiancée moved out of state not long after, somewhere quieter, somewhere without a Whitfield name attached to every door he might have once expected to open easily. Vivian I see less often now than I once did. Something shifted in her after that night, something I don't think she has fully recovered from. And I confess, I have not made enormous efforts to help her along in that recovery. There is a particular kind of grief in watching your child's future collapse in front of witnesses you invited yourself. And while I do feel a sister's sympathy for that grief, I find I no longer feel obligated to soften it on her behalf, the way I spent 22 years softening things for my father. Some debts, I have come to understand, are not mine to keep paying. As for my father, Preston Whitfield, who once told a 22-year-old version of me that I could marry the help if I wanted, who spent 2 decades making sure his own grandson understood exactly where he belonged. He is, these days,
a quieter man than I ever imagined he could become. The judicial nomination gone, several of his oldest social alliances quietly cooled in the aftermath of that Christmas Eve becoming, in the particular way these things travel through certain circles, something of a cautionary story. He still lives in that enormous house, though I no longer do. I moved out 3 weeks after that dinner into a small, sunlit apartment 2 blocks from Daniel and Sarah's place, and I have never once regretted the decrease in square footage. My father and I speak occasionally now, carefully, the way 2 people speak when they are both aware that an entire structure of pretense has collapsed between them, and neither quite knows yet what, if anything, might be built in its place. He asked me once, several months later, over an awkward, stilted lunch neither of us fully enjoyed, whether I thought Daniel might ever forgive him. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that forgiveness wasn't mine to promise on my son's behalf, but that I did know one thing for certain. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would have to be earned in the same slow, patient, unglamorous way Daniel had earned everything else in his life. Not through a grand gesture, through 22 years' worth of small, consistent corrections, offered without expectation of applause. He has, to his credit, begun trying. He attended Lily's school recital in the spring, sat quietly in the back row, did not once bring up the firm or the confirmation or anything resembling his old currency of status. He sent Daniel a card on the 1-year anniversary of Operation Waterline's closure. I know because Daniel showed it to me, still slightly bewildered by it. A short, plain note that read only, "I am proud to be your grandfather. I am sorry it took me this long to say so." It was, I think, the first entirely honest sentence my father had spoken to any of us in over 2 decades. Daniel, for his part, has settled into his role as deputy chief with the same quiet, unshowy competence he has brought to everything in his life. He was formally confirmed 6 months after that Christmas Eve, and the swearing-in ceremony, held this time at City Hall, with Sarah beside him and Lily proudly holding his father's old badge in her small hands, was, I am told by everyone who attended, a genuinely joyful occasion, entirely free of the tension that had shadowed every previous milestone in his life. I sat in the front row. Nobody made me sit anywhere else. Lily still talks about that Christmas Eve constantly, in the unfiltered, delighted way children process the moments that shape them. She tells her friends her daddy is the bravest man in the whole city. And she is, I am quite certain, entirely correct. She is taken to keeping her great-grandfather's old badge, Robert's badge, the one I carried in my handbag that night, in a small frame on her nightstand, beside a photograph of her father receiving his medal. And I think, watching her grow up surrounded by that kind of clear-eyed pride, rather than the quiet shame I grew up navigating in that same family, that perhaps this is the truest victory of the whole story. Not my father's downfall, not Chip's disgrace. Just one little girl who will never once have to wonder whether her father belongs at the table. I think about that phrase often, still. Failures eat where they belong. My father meant it as a cruelty, a small, sharp instrument he sharpened over 22 years and used again and again without ever once considering the cost. But he was right in the end, in a way he never intended to be. My son did belong somewhere very specific that night. He belonged at the head of a line of 40 officers who had traveled through freezing weather on Christmas Eve to make sure the world finally saw him clearly. He belonged in the arms of a daughter who never once doubted him. He belonged holding his own father's badge
in a hand that had spent 11 months proving, alone and unseen, exactly the kind of man he had grown into. He belonged, finally, at a table that was actually his to sit at. If there is a single thing I want you to carry away from this story, it is this. The people who tell you where you belong are very often the people least qualified to know. Sometimes, the family you were born into spends years teaching you to shrink, to wait outside, to accept a colder seat because it is easier than fighting for a warmer one. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do, the thing I wish with my whole heart I had done 22 years earlier instead of one Christmas Eve too late, is to simply stop agreeing with them. I lost a great deal of comfort the night I chose my son over my father's approval. I lost an enormous house, a certain kind of easy belonging, the illusion that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping love. But I gained something far more valuable in the exchange, something I don't think I truly understood the shape of until I watched 40 officers salute my son on a frozen lawn. I gained the right, finally, after 22 years, to look my own child in the eye and know that I had chosen him. Not silently, not quietly, not from a safe distance. Choosing him, out loud, in front of everyone who had ever doubted he deserved it. Have you ever had to choose between the family that raised you and the family you love, and found out, only when it truly mattered, which one you were actually willing to stand beside? I would love to hear your story in the comments below, whatever shape it took, whatever it cost you. And if this story moved you even half as much as living through it moved me, I would be so grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe for more stories like it. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next.